We got up to the issue of Im Olu Lo Yerdu on the very bottom of page Chav Zayin, and we were going to discuss, but we ran out of time, the issue of Avir HaMizbeach. And this is a sugya in Zvachim on Pei Zayin. What's the status of Avir HaMizbeach? We discussed various parts of the Mizbeach. What about the airspace? Let's say, for example, a carbon puzzle was suspended on top of the Avir, the airspace of the Mizbeach. Do we apply the principle of Kodshim HaMizbeach, and therefore Im Olu Lo Yerdu? The Gemara vacillates back and forth, and the final halacha seems to be that Im Olu Lo Yerdu applies equally to the Mizbeach itself and to the Avir Mizbeach. And therefore, Lo Yerdu is a din vadai. Not that we vacillate back and forth, but it's a vadai. However, there is one opinion that the Gemara doesn't really come to any definite conclusion, and it remains a suffix as to whether or not Im Olu Lo Yerdu applies or doesn't apply in the case of the Avir HaMizbeach. And here we move on to page Chav Ches. And in the footnote, he quotes the Mari Korkus. He was a very interesting person. He lived about 5.5 centuries ago. He was of the Mugurashe Sfarad, and his commentary on many parts of Kodshim, and especially Zroim, are very critical. Now, suffix zeh einu ela im ha'adam ha'oches es ha'ivarim omed ala karka v'oches es ha'ivarim b'kana me'al avir mizbech. A very weird kind of acrobatics in which the Kohen is holding on to the Eivarim of a carbon puzzle. He is standing on the Azara, and he's got a pole, a very tall pole, and at the top of the pole, he has the Eivarim, and he waves it, so to speak, over the airspace above the Mizbeach. There's another scenario where he's holding it and he's standing on the Mizbeach itself. It seems that everybody agrees in that case that we consider the Aver as if it is actually laid down on the Mizbeach, because the Kohen, in this case, is standing on the Mizbeach. So the pole, the end of which, the top of which is holding on to the Aver, is like an extension of his body. And therefore it's considered as if it's landing on the Mizbeach. But in a case where he, the Kohen, is standing on the ground of the Azara, holding a pole bent over the Mizbeach with the Eivarim on the top of that pole, that might remain a suffix in the view of the Mari Korkus as to whether or not the Mizbeach is Mekadosh the Eivarim. Again, keep in mind, as we pointed out yesterday, even if I assume that the Mizbeach is Mekadosh the Eivarim, bidin Im Olu Lo Yerdu, but nevertheless, the Bailim have not fulfilled their obligation as far as the carbon is concerned. All right, let's just make sure that we review that. He says, "Mikom makom eina carbon kosher." In other words, even when there's a chalos din of Im Olu Lo Yerdu, the carbon is not kosher and there's no ritzi Bailim. Again, there's going to be a chiyuv zrika and aktorah. We tried to work out why Zrika, but certainly Aktara. And that's generated by Im Olu Lo Yerdu. It's like a brand new carbon. It's not the old carbon, and it lost its identity. But in any event, that's what we discussed yesterday. Now, the question of the Sugya in Zvachim, is there a parallel halach in Klei Sharis? Meaning, just like we have halach that mizbeach is makadesh, and therefore lo yerdu. Does a kli sharis have the same power as the mizbeach to generate kedusha even in a carbon pus? And the Gemara seems to conclude clearly before we get to the Rishonim that kishem shemizbeach makadesh psulim kach kli sharis makadesh dam posel. So you put dam posel into a kli sharis, and it's not inferior to the mizbeach, and it's makadesh the dam. Again, it's not going to be a zrika sadam for that korban, but it's a brand new chiyuv zrika based on the kiddush process of, in this case, a kli sharis, and the paradigmic case of the mizbeach. But here we have a discussion in the Rishon. We have now dam posel in a kli sharis. One opinion the Rishon would have it that the halacha of im olu lo yerdu kicks in, and the kli sharis is makadesh the dam, and we're going to apply the principle of im olu lo yerdu, which means that we could go ahead and be zorik the dam on the mizbech. That's exactly what we're going to do because of the halacha of im olu lo yerdu. In the case of the mizbeach im olu lo yerdu, the dam or the emurim are already on the mizbeach. Here, we're going to take it from a kli sharis and do a zrika, implement a zrika on the mizbeach. And that seems to be the opinion of the Rambam in Hilchos Psuli Mikdash Per Gimel. However, the other opinion, which he attributes here to Rabbeinu Tam, maintains that the kli sharis is not makadesh dam posel for zrika. So what does it mean that the kli sharis is makadesh the dam? And he writes that din only applies in a case where olah hadam because al gabi mizbeach. In other words, you would have thought that if the dam is directly on the mizbeach, then im olu lo yerdu the mizbeach is mekadesh the dam. But if the dam is in a receptacle, it's in a kos, and he brought it onto the mizbeach now is inhibited, is unable to mekadesh the dam because the kos is now a chatzitza that separates the mizbeach from the dam. And the answer is no. It's not going to serve as chatzitza because the kli sharis, the kos itself, is able to sanctify the dam. But on the other hand, if the dam is in a kos, Rabbeinu Tam maintains, and the dam is posel, then we're not going to be zorik the dam against the Rambam. The Yesha Savru, now he quotes a third opinion, which he attributes to Rashi, that la'alacha, kiddush kli sharis means that im haya dam ha'posel kli sharis, mailim es ha'yimurim laktira. Interesting. On the one hand, Rashi seems to be on line with Rabbeinu Tam, that we're not going to be zorik the dam in a case where there's dam posel inside a kli sharis. But the efficacy and the result of kli sharis mekadsham, which is im olu lo yerdu, is with regard to the emurim. We're going to take the emurim and we're going to makriv them on the mizbech. So you don't have to come on to a case which Rabbeinu Tam came on to where he took the kos and he put it on the mizbeach, and now the issue is, would the kos be a chatzitza between the dam and the mizbeach? And we're going to say no, makadsham, it's not a chatzitza. But no, that kli sharis makadsham has a much more far-reaching impact because it's going to allow us lechatchila to be maktir the murim al gamizbech, and then we have Rambam shita that we will be zorik the dam. Now, we've been discussing the possibility that in a case of im olulo yerdu in basar, it means that we'll be maktir the basar on the mizbeach. But we've been assuming that that has a parallel halacha, and that's what we're going to analyze now, that the dam itself could be subject to zrika. Nechleku tanoim. This is going to be an issue back at the time of the Mishnah. Alma, meaning lagabi ma, never adin shalim olo yerd. According to one school of thought, it's only with regard to the emurim. So you have emurim psulim that went on to the mizbeach, and im olo yerd, you'll be marked to the emurim. But there's only a din of im olo yerdu of kiddush hamizbeach in a case of that which is royal ishim. Now, I'm not exactly sure what he means by royal ishim, but I think what he means is it's something that has a din of aktorah on the eish of the mizbeach, and that applies exclusively to the emurim. It could not possibly apply to the dam because we don't do any zrika of dam onto the eish on the mizbeach, so therefore there's no din of zrika sadam at all, because the whole halacha of imolo yerdu applies only to royally ishim, which is the emurim, and not to the dam. But yesh mishasover shegam dam pasul sha'ol mizbeach kid sha'ol mizbeach v'zarkin also. If the dam went on to the mizbeach, let's say, for example, the case of Rebbeinu Tam, it was held in a mizrach, and the mizrach is a klishare, so there's no chatzitza. Once the dam got onto the mizbeach, then we zorek the dam, which means that the halacha of im olo yerdu applies not just to royally ishim, but also to dam. And la halacha, we're not sure, it's machlokes achronim, whether or not im olo yerdu applies to the dam as far as rika is concerned. Now we have another issue. What kind of psulim are we talking about when we apply the principle of the olulo yerdu? Emurim shenifsalu b'psul shalina yotze otame. So we have the classic psulim, the categories of lina, where we passed the allotted time. Yotze, we took it out of the mechitzos, or tuma, it became tum. Now, what about a psul of pigu, where the kohen had a machsheves chutz l'zmano or chutz l'mkomo, or we can have a psul of machsheves shalol l'shma. He probably has a mind in chatos or pesach. Oh, bizrika shalol b'mkom. The zrika was not done in the right place. All the above are included under the halacha of him olu lo yered. All psulim. V'chenim nifsal al yidei kabbalah uzrikas kohanim tmeim. Not only if the basar became tamei, but even if the kohen became tamei. And the kohen now is makabel the dam, he was zorek the dam, and it's on top of the mizbeach. So there's no issue about the emurim. We mentioned before that there's an issue about the dam, whether we do zrika in a case of dam pasul that was taken onto the mizbeach, and whether or not we apply the halacha of Olo Yerdu in Dam to the point to which we'll zorek the Dam. But certainly, if the Emurim got onto the Mizbeach and they were puzzled in any of these enumerated categories of psul, the halacha is in Olo Yerdu will be maktir the Emurim on the Mizbeach. Okay, now we had an opinion that im olo yerdu in dam does not allow zrika. According to that opinion, let's say the dam became possible, let's say rina or yotze or tome, vizarku al gabi mizbeach. According to that maniyom, they shouldn't have been zorik the dam, but they went and they were zorik the dam. The murim have not yet been placed on the mizbeach, but the dam, which is possible, is on the Mizbeach. So im olu murim Mizbeach, as we said before, l'kuli almim olu yered maktirin also. But here's a case where the dam became possible, and he was zorik the dam on the Mizbeach. It's not clear what the final conclusion is as far as the Murim is concerned. Again, if the Murim were all on Mizbech, everybody agrees that im olo yer the maktir also. Okay. Now, are there any possible scenarios where, even with regard to a Murim, im olu yerdu, we're not going to be maktir a murim? And here we're going to introduce the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. But first, let's talk about the simple shita of Rabbi Shimon. Karban nishchat b'layla, nifsal b'kabbalah, ubizrikas kohanim, nifsal adam, b'psul yotze, nishpach adam. So Rabbi Shimon Omer, af shelo zarku es adam, Im olu ha'imurim l'mizbeach maktirnos. So in all these cases of a carbon puzzle, because the shechita was balayla, there was a Kohen puzzle who did the Kabbalah Saddam, the Zrika Saddam, Nifsal Adam B'Psul Yotze, Nishpach Adam. In all these cases, Reb Shimon says that even without Zrika Saddam, if the Emurim were taken up on the Mizbech, we're maktir the Emurim. However, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Im olo ha'emurim yerd. In all the above cases, im olu lo yerd. And it seems that these are the exceptional cases of nishchat balayla, nifsala, b'kabbalas kohanim psulim, or zrikas kohanim psulim. And in the case where the dam became puzzle, it was nishpach or it was yotze, is Rabbi Yehuda says, even though the Emurim were brought on the Mizbeach, yerd, take them off the Mizbeach. There's no din of him olu lo yerd. It seems that Rabbi Yehuda in general accepts the principle of him olu lo yerd, but here is a case where there was certain specific psulim and the dam was not nizrak al gabi mizbeach. The dam itself became puzzle and there was no zrikas dam. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that in this case we are so early in the process of hakrovas hakarban, it became puzzle already. Then we're not going to apply the principle of ma'olu lo yerd. Now, in the case of Kodshim, the shechita and the Kabbalah Saddam have to be done in the tzafon. He went ahead, this Kohen, and the shchita or the kabbalah sadam was done in the daram instead of the tzafon. Even though this is a psul, we're going to apply the principle of him olu lo yeredu. We're going to be makriv murim. Whether or not we'll be Zorik Dam, we discussed earlier, but if he went ahead, he was Zorik Dam, and he took the Murim and he brought him on the Mizbeach, im olu lo yeredu. Even though this is a case where the psul was in the shchita, he shechted in the daram instead of the tzafon. Im olu lo yeredu. Now he has a toast. After Shitas Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds that even if there was a psul of dam, the dam was yotze, or it was nishpa, and there was no zrika. Nevertheless, im olu haimurim lo yeredu against Rabbi Yehuda. Ein olu b'nishpach adam li achar kabbalah. There was at least a kabbalah sadam. We've gotten to that point, advancing in the avodas hakorban, that we already have a kabbalah sadam. We're only missing now zrika. Achim nishpach adam kodem kabbalah. Before he received the dam in the receptacle, the dam was on the floor. It fell on the floor of the azara. Here's another example of him olu yeredu, because the process of the avoda is in a very early stage and the korban became possible. If on the other hand, after the dam was nishpach, and we talk about nishpach adam kodem kabbalah, but somehow he gathered together the dam and he did his rika, so that's called nizrak hadam lebasof liachar shenishpach, is according to Rabbi Shimon in olu lo yeredu. So in olu yeredu, according to Rabbi Shimon, only applies to the case of nishpach hasdam kodem kabbalah sadam. I'm not sure exactly what he means by nishpach adam. He probably means that lo kibel sadam vadam nishpach al haaretz. Now he has a suffix. The psulim, in those cases where im olu yeredu, for example, those psulim in which Rabbi Yehuda holds im olu yeredu, what happens if the emurim not only were on the mizbeach, but mashla behema are? Could be that in this case, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that im olu lo yeredu. Why? Because it was already mashla behen ha'esh. And the Mishnah Melech adds another point. He says, if you want to say, well, there's a suffix, maybe im olu lo yeredu would apply here, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, because it's already mashla ben ha'or. But he says if you took it off the mizbech, you're not going to bring it back onto the mizbech. Now, in those cases where Rabbi Yehuda says im olu yeredu, and again, we're spending a lot of time with Rabbi Yehuda because we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So im olu yeredu, for example, there were psulim in the dam, like yotze or nishpach. Im olu yerdu. Mikomakom zarek es adam. He went ahead and he was zarek the dam. And we have halacha of kidsho mizbeach, kolto mizbeach. That's going to apply not only to the basar but also to the dam. And therefore, if he went ahead and he was shofech the dam and he was zarek the dam, then even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that if olo yerdu. Now the language here is very challenging, right? V'hainu she's kizrika le'inyan shelo yiskanech adam. Oh, we have to know more about what it means shelo yiskalech adam. Now, one principle that works, that operates with regard to dam, is that if dam is nishpach, then if he didn't have any zrika at all, he cannot collect the dam. Sorry, he can collect the dam. But if there was a zrika already, then we're not going to collect the dam and have a second zrika. Once the first zrika was possible, there's no room for a subsequent zrika. So nishpach, he can collect the dam from the floor of the azara leso, but only if he hadn't done any zrika at all. Okay. Now let me just make one more point over here, and then we'll conclude this part of today's shir for today, and we'll hop over to Masechta Yevamos. Nifsal Adam. Remember, we had certain cases of psul dam where Rabbi Yehuda holds him olu yerdu. What does that mean, him olu yerdu? Is it referring to the emurim, dafka to the emurim? The emurim were put on top of his mizbeach. We have to take them down. But as far as the dam itself is concerned, lo yardu. I mean, we don't have to take them down from the mizbech. We want to decide whether to do a zrika on the mizbech. And if he went ahead and he did take the dam onto the mizbech, then according to one school of thought, Rabbi Yehuda would agree lo yerdu, and he's going to go ahead and do the zrika. So the din of im olu yerdu, according to Rabbi Yehuda, would apply in a case where he didn't do any zrika of the dam. Then we're going to take the emurim off the mizbeach. But it could be possible, and again, this is a tremendous machlokes, that if the dam itself was taken up on the mizbeach, we will go ahead and be zorik the dam, and in that case, im olu lo yerdu, will not remove the emurim from the mizbeach, but rather will burn the emurim on the mizbeach. Now, there's a whole list, and this will take up tomorrow, of psulim that are called enam psulim b'kodesh, meaning the carbon is disqualified for the mizbeach, but not from the dinim that apply to Kodshim in specifically. You know, like a psul yotze or a psul lina or psul tameh. But there's a whole other list of psulim that apply because of the inherent status of the zebach, of the animal. And the question is going to be whether or not we apply the principle of im olu lo yerdu. So we're now talking about psulim in the guf hazebach. I'll just give one example. We'll pick it up tomorrow. Let's say the animal became a treifa. Is no akrav al gabi mizbeach. And again, there's a whole list here: Rovea, Nirva, Muksa, Neva, and Esnan, Mechir Kelem, and Kalayim, and Treifa, Yotzei Dofen. So we'll go through in Mitzvah Shem that list tomorrow. So let's just make a note of where we got up to here. on page Chaf